Yes, thank you very much. It's a wonderful privilege and opportunity to be here this moment to share in this debate. And we're grateful to the Pan-African Network for this opportunity. My name is Jerome Bright Ogenroth from Team J, which is a negative team. And my teammate, Sadabu Quraishi from Sierra Leone, in absentia, is unable to join me today, but I'm going to be representing him. And I also thank the organizers as well as the moderators of this debate today. Resolved, should governments prioritize funding genetic research to develop climate resilient crops over other agricultural innovations? And as the negative team, we disagree with this resolution. Basically, given the fact that over the years, genetic research has made remarkable strides and advancements. Basically, scientists have been able to map out and crop DNA basically precisely than in years before. However, climate resilience in agriculture really goes beyond the genetics and takes into account the complex intricacies, issues like soil, farming practices, and all that. So even while improving genetic traits is valuable, focusing heavily on it while sidelining these other factors that play a role, which sometimes involve more immediate and practical solutions for farmers, is not a good approach. To begin with, we believe that governments should not prioritize funding research in crop resilient, develop climate resilient crops over other agricultural innovations, because when you look at the needs versus the costs and benefits, climate resilient crops are not the most beneficial and cost-effective strategy to solve or address agriculture needs for the following reasons. First of all, the capital investment is very intensive in the sense that research and development of these genetically modified crops are costly and slow. A new genetically modified crop might take about 10 to 15 years if you factor in all these other things like the field trials and everything that is really involved, and costing millions of dollars, you know? But how much of that if investment actually turns into tangible returns for farmers, tangible, helpful uses? It means that farmers need immediate solutions, whether it is better farming techniques, irrigation technologies, you know, other than having to wait for a whole decade for just one crop. This is an example of the investment over the last period of the last 10 years. You can see just in 2024, over $161 million has been spent, you know, but how much of that has actually directly helped farmers? That is a question that I would want the affirmative team to answer. Secondly, genetic solutions alone do not solve climate change problems. It is a mix of issues of adaptation, resilience, and mitigation, most importantly, which is not even addressed by genetic research. You know, additional factors like the ecosystem, soil health, farming practices, and all those things come into play, you know, and as well as conservation agriculture, you know, technologies like uh, crop rotation, minimum tillage principle. All these boost crop yields by up to 30%, research has shown, while enhancing fertility and water retention. So we believe that Government would rather diversely fund these approaches and invest in clean energy as well. All these are more effective ways to combat climate vulnerability other than genetically modified crops. But also the issue is low acceptance of these crops and the adoption. There are social and regulatory and ethical concerns around GMOs which compromise its acceptance, you know? So that means it is not reliable and dependable as the ultimate solution for governments and farmers, you know, against climate vulnerability. Instead, the underlying issues that compromise adoption should be handled first. Another thing is so basically, this slide is showing a summary of the adoption issues that are facing these GMOs, the ethical concerns, the exploitation by companies, the economic concerns, and environmental concerns as well, that together contribute to the low acceptance of these crops. There are also issues of accessibility and equitability. You will realize that over 80% of the world's food is produced by smallholder farmers who sometimes may not be able to afford these crops because of their high costs, and also other issues of like depending on these biotech companies. Even worse, these crops are prone to corporate monopolies for the different organizations that have contributed to developing them. An example is the terminator gene technology from Monsanto. You know, we all know that the accessibility of that technology was very much difficult because farmers can only plant it for one season, and the next season they have to invest afresh. So that means alternative approaches like soil health improvement, precision agriculture, and climate smart farming are cheaper, more accessible and scalable approaches. Another thing is the compromise test. Sometimes genetic alterations affect um, this has been shown by widespread campaigns from the complaints from the farmers. It affects the biochemistry of the crops to the extent that the the taste of the food is compromised. An example is the bananas in Uganda. There were locally genetically improved bananas in Uganda that were not, they were improved to be bigger in size and produce higher yield. Yes, the bunches are big, but farmers complained they were not as tasty as the conventional banana. And that alone compromised how much farmers were able to access it. The issues of biodiversity. We cannot ignore the fact that there is a high possibility that these crops, that genes could be spread, transferred through pollen to, the other crops. And there's going to be that genetic exchange that threatens, biodiversity. We'll risk very much losing the native species of crops because of a mix or gene flow that they would have in exchange with the GMOs. There are also testimonies of allergic responses, In 1997, as early as that, Taylor confirmed in a research that uh, newly introduced proteins is a source of some kind of concerns, Every time you have a newly introduced gene, there is a high chance, unless proven and discounted by rigorous in vivo testing, there is a high chance that the foods could be allergenic, or toxic in some way to people. There are also regulatory concerns. We all know about this, that approving some of these crops takes a lot of time. So all of these are challenging or compromising factors. There are also unintended consequences, Sometimes we have invasive species developing when some of these crops crossbreed, um, with the native ones. For example, we have the testimony of the emergence of herbicide-resistant weeds in the United States, because of some crops that were modified for, for how modified to be resistant to a certain weed, but um, after some time, the weeds also underwent some genetic changes and they became resistant to herbicides, you know. So all these are problems of GMOs. And lastly, they are short term. They are basically a short term gain, which does not solve the long term issue. So I want to spend the next few minutes to counter some of the arguments that were raised, constructive arguments raised by the affirmative team. Number one, they talked about food security. Yes, the yields may improve, but at what cost? These crops take decades, you know, and smallholder farmers do not access them. So you are not addressing the underlying issues that affect food security, like poverty, inequality, and economic and even political issues. So, you know, the food distribution systems. So unless you tackle these underlying factors and invest in sustainable farming and equitable distribution, you are not really improving food security. The other benefits, the other is that they talked about the economic benefits for farmers and national economies. This is basically for the large agribusinesses that reap the profits and corporations. The low income farmers, we insist, they are only suffering from the high costs of seeds and inputs. An example is that in India, when BT cotton was introduced, it increased the debt and farmers' suicides because farmers were suffering from high input costs and sometimes crop failures. So on the contrary, we think that low-cost, sustainable agricultural practices would provide more equitable and economic benefits for farmers. We talked about climate change adaptation. In the long term, yes, maybe this can help, but also it is irrelevant if farmers cannot survive the immediate short-term problems. You know, innovations in agriculture, you know, soil conservation, crop diversification, and also a system of practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions uh, are the better option, you know, because GM crops are still vulnerable to new climatic changes in the long run. So we think that sustainable farming practices is better. So for climate change mitigation. So they talked about enhancing rural livelihoods and reducing rural urban migration. Again, we go back to the argument that these GM crops basically benefit large-scale farmers and corporations more than the majority of smallholder farmers. And there are associated risks, you know, that may worsen the rural poverty. So we think that investing in low cost and sustainable farming practices and infrastructure is more direct and bringing equitable benefits. They talked about supporting agricultural innovation and research, yet they are also saying it should be prioritized. If we prioritize genetic improvement, we risk neglecting the innovations in agroecology, education, and farming. So, which are all important in addressing environmental challenges. We think that a balanced approach to research funding is a more comprehensive way to achieve progress. They also talked about diversification of crops for better nutrition. We think that this actually neglects this. It does neglect dietary diversity in the sense that instead, if we promote traditional crops, you know, it's a more sustainable way to improve nutrition because GM crops face public resistance and regulatory challenges already. So if we invest in them instead of local food systems, you know, and nutrition education, it would not be effective. They also talked about protection against pests and diseases, but this is really not effective because even when the crops are pest resistant or disease resistant, one, you risk evolving super pests, such as in the case of BT maize, which resulted in pest resistance. Or you also risk neglecting some cheaper ways, you know, biopesticides. Some of these diseases can actually mutate. So in the long run, or pests can mutate. So in the long run, you have not even solved the problem per se. They also talked about efficient use of water and soil resources. We think that sustainable practices like crop rotation and agroforestry is a more effective approach at preserving resources. GM crops may even worsen, you know, soil degradation if they encourage monoculture and reliance on some farm inputs to enhance their growth. Instead, we think that a holistic resource management approach is necessary for long-term sustainability. Second, lastly, they talked about access to global funding and investment. On the contrary, sometimes some of these research works come with a lot of strings attached: intellectual property rights, foreign dependency, and some of these things undermine local systems and international sovereignty. So, national sovereignty. So instead, we think that if we prioritize in agriculture, local grassroots agriculture, and empower the host households for long-term gains without compromising autonomy, it's a more effective way to empower ourselves locally. And when we are empowered locally, we can then be able to supply uh, and invest at a global scale. So the other thing is they talked about reduced dependence on food aid and imports. On the contrary, we think that if systemic issues, policies, infrastructure, and local capacity is invested in, GM crops GM crops may actually require inputs and, chemicals and many other things that come with them. So if we instead foster self-sufficiency and empower ourselves locally, it's a better approach. In a nutshell, while genetic research, as we summarize and conclude as a team, while genetic research has a role in agriculture, it is not a magic pill against climate change resilience. If we say this, we're only meaning that it is risky, costly, and exclusionary, and so unwise for governments to prioritize it over solutions that have more immediate and substantial, long-term gains at a lower cost. Instead, governments should balance, yes, not neglect genetic modification research entirely, but governments must balance a modest research, with proven already existing or cheaper, scalable, affordable solutions that can benefit the millions of farmers whose survival is at stake if we wait for these GMOs, the genetically engineered miracles, rather than investing in solutions that help them now. So we think that it is a more effective strategy for governments to go with policies that reflect urgency, inclusivity, and sustainability rather than putting all our eggs in one scientific basket. Thank you very much. I beg to submit.